Hello, welcome everybody. We are thrilled to have you with us at this webinar today. My name is Zelda Keller and I am the Executive Director at the Institute for Climate and Peace. When rights are accepted, neighbors enjoy good relations, information flows freely, and resources are equitably distributed, all indicators of positive peace. Exponentially fewer people suffer the effects of natural disaster. The Institute for Climate and Peace is a climate justice organization based in Honolulu, Hawaii, that understands the data and advances positive peace to build equity and climate resiliency for communities most affected by climate change. Thank you all for being here with us today. This afternoon, we have with us our wonderful moderator, as well as peace educator and ICP co-founder and senior advisor, Dr. Maya Sotoro. I'm also pleased to introduce Maxine Burkett, professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. And she is an expert in the law and policy of climate change and a co-founder and senior advisor at the Institute for Climate and Peace. We'd especially love to extend a warm welcome to Professor of International Peace Building at the University of Notre Dame, author and practitioner in the fields of conflict transformation and peace building, John Paul Lederach. We are grateful to have you three here with us and welcome everybody. So at the Institute for Climate and Peace, we like to commence our webinars with an opening practice to welcome everyone to this space and get grounded for the discussion. John, Paul, I know in your peace building journey, you've often turned to the art of haiku writing and has seen it as a revitalizing activity and a compass for your work. I read in a poem of yours that you wrote, "I take haiku like vitamins, one a day. My vitamin it's an antiviral thing." And so I realized we all share this love of haikus, and it seemed to me the perfect way to start this discussion today. So I'd like to invite you each, John Paul, Maxine, and Maya, to share a haiku that you came prepared with today to get us warmed up for the dialogue and set the tone. I will turn it over to you, John Paul.
Thank you, Zelda, and hello, everyone. Aloha, those of you on the island. It's a privilege to be here. So I've chosen a haiku that came actually from the introduction that Zelda made was an introduction to an unfolding haiku that I wrote during the period of the pandemic from January to April into early May. And I wrote haikus every day, but I chose one a week that captured something of that week. And I'm often, when I'm writing haiku, I'm quite cognizant of either the particular space that I'm in, especially around nature, but I'm also very cognizant of the language scape. That is what it is that people are languaging around us. So this haiku picks up from a period that was in early April, late March, and it's the following. They say we're at war. I think we're falling in love with the human race. I'll pass it on to Maxine.
Thank you, John Paul. That's really beautiful, and it's such a privilege to be a panelist with you. And I'm very grateful for all the work you've done, and for the encouragement to write a haiku. I can't say that I have done much of this, and as I was sharing with Maya, I spent a lot of time counting syllables on my fingers in order to make sure I was complying. I chose to write a couple of different haiku, and the first one I'll share is actually more framing around climate justice. And so sort of a quick way I like to think about climate justice and how it relates to the challenge that we have in front of us is sort of encapsulated in these few thoughts. Sacrificed bodies, the carbon economy knows no boundaries. So I will share a more upbeat one afterward later on, but for now I'll pass it on to Maya.
That was powerful. Thank you so much. I too am a haiku novice. Chose to write one today with gratitude for the encouragement. that is about bringing together identity, circumstance, and the work of positive peace building. Water, wind, fire, earth, conflict, migration, flood, storm, together transform. Thank you all so much for being here, all of you panelists, everyone in my ICP family, and of course, all of you attendees. This is a moment when our world and our communities are cracked open with conflict, with struggle, with suffering, with pandemic, with loss, but also we are seeing with greater clarity, perhaps, and deeper understanding, I hope, how to transform trauma and hurt and conflict into growth and better leadership and a movement, I hope, that will involve all of us here together. So let's just dive in. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'd like to begin with you, John Paul. In your book, The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace, you discuss the importance of turning points and how the image of living in a 200-year present can help us to think about and understand turning points. Can you tell us more about the 200-year present concept and how it can assist all of us, our human community, to develop a deeper sense of who we are, where we're situated, and where we're going?
Absolutely. Thank you, Maya. By the way, Maya, Maxine, those were fantastic haikus. You are now going to be bit by the viral haikuness. So you will be finding yourself doing this as you walk in places. The 200-year present and turning points. I learned of the 200-year present from a mentor of mine, Elise Boulding, who was one of the early founders of the peace studies field, especially here in the North American context. Elise was a spectacular person. She had a very simple way of having you experientially understand the concept. So maybe the easiest way is to just do that for everybody in case not everyone is familiar with it, because it's totally accessible in this very moment. So it starts by asking you this question. Think back to when you were a young child and remember the face of the oldest person that you knew who held you in their lap. So you think of the face of the oldest person you knew when you were a very young child that held you in their lap. And once you have that face in mind, speculate, if you don't know it, speculate back to roughly to their birth date. When were they born? So my great-grandmother Miller, for example, whose lap I sat on and who extraordinarily lived to be 100 years old, was born in the 1860s. So that's your starting point. The second part of the process is to think of the youngest person in your extended family and web of close relationships, the youngest person. And get that person's face in your mind for a second. And then speculate out if they lived a robust, full life, to what year, roughly what decade might they live. So I have a grandson now, I'm a grandfather as of a year ago. And Isa, a beautiful young boy, is likely to live to see the turn of the century if he lives a robust life. So now I take 1860 to sometime past 2100, and when you subtract those one from the other, you usually find that you're somewhere between 200, maybe 220 years. And Elise always called that your 200-year present, as in past, present, future. And the phrase that I would recall her saying quite often was, these were the hands that touched you, and these are the people who your hands have touched. So there is a continuity across that span. And I think the significance to your question, Maya, about our moment now and the question of turning points, that in part, especially in a couple of the books that I was writing, Moral Imagination was one of those, was the experience of working in peace building when things got very, very tough. Most of you know that pursuing social change is not an easy process. And I found quite often that myself and the people that I really cared a lot about, especially in local communities, had four very distinct kinds of experiences. One was that there could be very clearly moments where you have the experience that you feel like things are moving forward, that stuff is finally starting to happen. And then suddenly you come to an experience where something comes almost like a wall, and you run straight in to that almost head first. And it's like everything stops and you feel like it's completely stuck. The third experience is that worse than the wall, it all starts to go backwards. Things that you worked on are undone, taken away, broken down. And that can, it's actually, these are deeply, almost depressing moments. They can really affect your emotional soul. The fourth experience is probably the hardest, and that's when everything falls apart. And I think any of us that probably have worked in peace building around, say, a process of trying to get former enemies to talk know how often things actually just totally fall apart. And you have to start over and over and over again. Resilience, of course, comes to mind because the idea of that is actually cyclical, that you won't know to place the particular moment you're in unless you have a more expansive time horizon in which to locate yourself. So it gives you the wherewithal to have the resiliency to start again in the worst of times. But it also has, I think, what I call the gift of pessimism. When everything seems to be flowing, you know, as I say in Spanish, ojo, take a careful look. It may be that we have not attended to the things that we thought we had in place. And so it I think is a way to bring a deep sense of respect to the flow of time and to the flow of, quite often, what it is that has been left to us from our ancestors in many regards. That is the ability to take note that we are not the first, but we are among the family. And the family will find a way to move forward and to continue to pick up, to rise again, whatever those metaphors. And I think that's, you know, it's significant because we are in moments right now where a lot of stuff feels stopped, if not falling apart. Deeply so in some of what we're facing in the issues that we have as a global human family.
Beautiful. That is so powerful. I often talk about the need to wash the eyes, ojos limpios or ojos abiertos, but this notion of revisiting a particular moment and where we are situated in that moment allows us to kind of renew ourselves, our commitments, and our sense of family. What you said about the hands who have touched me and those whom my hands will touch, that offers me great comfort. I think it's so beautiful, and it makes me feel connected in ways that are so necessary in this work. Thank you. So my next question is for both of you, Maxine and John Paul. The last few months have seen international pandemic as well as intensifying unrest, intolerance for systemic racism, which is important. Maxine, these are, in the eyes of many, tough times, and this is in part something that John Paul has started to address, but you maintain that the day after tomorrow is really quite beautiful. So I wanted to ask you, Maxine, first, and then John Paul, if you have anything to add, you know, in terms of the day after tomorrow, do you think it's too late for deep peace, given where we are in the world as a collective human society? Can you speak a little bit to this notion of optimism versus pessimism, and why is the day after tomorrow beautiful, Maxine?
Yeah, Maya, thank you for that. I have a couple of reflections just based on what John Paul has shared. And one that I'll start out with, which is based on my son's very clear-eyed approach to the world. When we presented a glass to him that was about, I would say, half full, we asked him whether or not he thought it was half full or half empty, and he said both. And I said, That's a very unique and wonderful perspective, and showed a sort of a level of clarity that I wasn't expecting from a 9-year-old, but also a level of truth in the fact that any given situation can actually be both of those things. And we can draw from the lessons of optimism and pessimism. What I love about the 200-year present is that, as John Paul was describing that, it actually made me think of my great-grandmother, who was born in Jamaica. We were all born in Jamaica. I'm an immigrant, but who was born in Jamaica in the sort of turn of the century, the turn of the 19th and 20th century, at a time that was so profoundly different than what the world looks like today. It was a colony. Sort of the economy was essentially, it was colonized, but it was sort of stripped of the sort of the formalities of slavery, but the same dynamics were at play. And I think, my great-grandmother as a young woman would see the present day as quite a miraculous turn of events, right? Not only Jamaica's independence, but the possibilities that we are seeing come to pass for women and women of color. And that's also acknowledging too that there's so much further to go. But you can imagine in that 100+ years from now that there may be quite a different future for the people for whom we will be ancestors. And so that's actually a really beautiful thought. But to the point that that we're making about what it means to conceive of a day after tomorrow that's not one of fantastic blockbuster films, right? We have to acknowledge that what we have come to accept as part of our daily life, as part of sort of being a part of a civilization today, is one that's really saddled with burdensome environmental toxins and other costs. And I just wanted to, in thinking about this, sort of emphasize that, in fact, we've gotten used to the impacts of the carbon economy. And recently we've even seen that the relationship of that carbon economy to poor health outcomes when it comes to acute events like the pandemic are ones that we shouldn't be asked to tolerate, not even asked in many circumstances, forced to tolerate in certain communities. So one sort of more benign example is the fact that we have a visible vistas. People could see mountain ranges with the pause in transportation related emissions. And it was really quite phenomenal. There was, whether or not it was actually measurable and accurate, people were imagining dolphins and in parts of the Mediterranean they hadn't seen it. There was a real sort of notion that nature had been veiled from us in some pretty significant ways, and we've gotten used to it. And certainly industrialization makes a big part of that, part of our daily lives. But we're also seeing, again, in the acute circumstances, that exposure to fine particulates from industrial pollution, from proximity to major roadways, these are the kinds of things that have set up both chronic and acute circumstances, predominantly in communities of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities, that have made us more vulnerable to the impacts of these kinds of shocks like COVID-19. And so why have we become used to it? The bottom line is that the fossil fuel economy has sort of mete out a cost, both from extraction to combustion. And we're seeing the fact that oil spills, air pollution and poor air quality, contaminated waterways, high incidences of cancer spiking in certain communities. We've gotten used to these things. And in fact, without a carbon economy, when you get past the fossil fuel economy, there's actually clear skies, better health outcomes, better job opportunities, all of these things that are really quite wonderful to consider as an alternative to what we've gotten used to today. The last piece of this that makes me more on the sort of glasses half full side of things is that there's a promise in combining climate and positive peace building, which is essentially what we're trying to do in these kinds of conversations, and then writ large in our organization and the partners that we're building and partnerships that we're building. Our emphasis is on social cohesion, right? We've highlighted local examples of that. The fact that Hawaii has been a really powerful place for demonstrating what it means to be in partnership and kinship in relationship with our neighbors, and that's what makes this place unique. We're also seeing examples of how that kind of social trust and social cohesion benefits communities at a state level. Bill McKibben just recently wrote an article in the New Yorker that was highlighting the fact that Vermont has very different outcomes when it comes to COVID. And a lot of that is about the social trust that's been built and the processes that they engage in terms of decision-making, in terms of really the kinds of things we expect from our neighbors. And at the national level, we've also looked at countries where there are high levels of equity, high levels of trust, high level of social cohesion, and their strong positive peace indicators, and I'm thinking of New Zealand in particular in this case, it's enviable and has borne out in the acute shocks of COVID, as well as the planning that they're doing around climate change at this point. So in many ways, we see the possibilities of climate change and peace building, providing a roadmap and a relationship and a conversation about how we might perceive better outcomes in the future. And certainly as we transition away from a fossil fuel economy, it will become easier for us to live better lives as well.
Powerful, thank you, excellent. John Paul, do you have anything to add about the date after tomorrow? Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so just a couple of thoughts to add to this, the excellent overview that Maxine gave, and I very much am on her side of the finding of beauty amidst whatever it is that we're facing, and that our journey toward becoming more fully human with each other, it really sits at the core of so much of what we're facing. I'm struck by, so I'm going to go back to my great-grandmother. When I said the 1860s, I had an experience just recently of being in a small group where we were looking at the question of this systemic racism here in the US, given the recent events, particularly since those of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I sometimes realize that when I blurt something out, it reveals both light and shadow at the same time. I suppose that's true for all of us. So my blurt at one point was, this should have been taken care of in the 60s. And then I went to this very intriguing digital tool called the 400 Years of Oppression in the US, which is a time history looking at the peoples who have suffered under systemic oppression and racism in our country here in the US. It's an extraordinary piece that's very much visual. It's based on ways that you can, tracking that, it dawned on me in the middle of this thing that you could say it should have been taken care of in the 60s, but you could pick a century. 1860s was 100 years before the 1960s. 100 years prior to that would have been the 1760s, around the period, of course, of our early Constitution writing. Which begged the question for me in a rather extraordinary way. I probably won't live to see the year 2060, but are we ready to more fully embrace what we all have known must change? That we are, in fact, a deeply multiracial, rich for the diversity that we have, but that we have to create ways in which this tenacious and vicious system, viciousness in systems has a tenacity to it that requires an equal courage to continue to face it. And I think that's in large part the challenge that we see. Where I draw a deep silver lining in the pandemic, for me it was extraordinary. I think it's the largest global human movement where people acted at roughly the same time period. This was almost to the days, the months and the days where people moved to hunker down or to take great more care about the ways that they were sheltering and or responding to things that they had to do in their social scene. So across the globe, we had a sign that it is possible for the whole of the human family to actually act in concert, which I think gives precisely the kind of thing that Maxine was pointing at. It's the sort of thing that we will need if we are to face the deepest challenges to our survival as a human race. We have to develop a concept that we are part of a much wider global family that needs to take care of each other. And that has not been a concept that we've been able to find ways to envision in practical terms But this last set of months, we've seen more signs of it, I think, than we have maybe at any other point in history.
Well, that is a perfect lead into my next question, which is for you, Maxine. I'd like to move a little more deeply into that. Both of you have been exceedingly articulate. And Maxine, much of your scholarship and your previous comments have noted that the impacts of climate change are experienced differently in different communities. And we at ICP, of course, think of ourselves as an environmental justice organization to some extent, and we highlight the need for humanity to negotiate the climate crisis in a spirit of fairness, justice, and generosity for one another. Can you speak more about this really important topic? How do we see climate resilience happening from a climate justice perspective? And importantly, what are the processes that need to take place in order for us to craft a better, fair, more just future environmentally?
Yeah, there are a few ways for us to think about this. I'll first say that I have, and I know of a number of other climate justice advocates and practitioners who have been in rooms with people who are saying, you know, they believe climate change, they want to act aggressively, but think justice is just muddying the conversation, right? You're trying to throw all of these other things in and you're going to tank the whole affair. This is something that comes up routinely. I could give numerous examples of it. And what that means to me is that we are still, with that approach, just looking for low-hanging fruit rather than really grasping at the roots. And Angela Davis actually said that radical simply means grasping at the roots, right? What is it that's causing this to happen, and how do we extract that from our processes of decision-making, our decisions about who's at the table, the adequacy of our solutions, right? So we know, certainly here in Hawaii, that if the answer is scaling up renewable energy, who is it on the back of? And is that a sufficient way to make a decision to simply saying, well, we need to change where the electrons are coming from versus which are the communities that are sacrificed, which are the bodies, human, land, marine, otherwise, that are going to be negatively impacted by it. So I think the first and most important part of this work is understanding what the roots are, what the root causes are. And what we know is that in the context of climate change, even increased vulnerability to its impacts have a root cause that is oftentimes about the relationship that the global South has had with its colonial past, with respect to underdevelopment, with respect to arbitrary borders, which becomes really relevant in the context of climate migration, for example. This is also true in terms of economic underdevelopment in certain communities in the global North. Certainly in the United States and Canada, there are a number of examples of who ends up being, again, in these sort of sacrifice zones. And it's really about understanding how we get to the point of correcting those vulnerabilities that have a root and a cause that is much more about a political economy than simply where we're getting our energy from, although that's obviously critically important. It also requires a sort of place and culture responsive approaches. For example, I do a lot of work in climate migration, and I was told by a colleague once at the University of South Pacific that, you know, let us figure out how we're going to make decisions about who moves and to where. We had approached this with a spirit of welcome to our Pacific cousins. We're not as concerned with these notions of boundaries and nation states that Western Enlightenment has imposed upon us. The notion of roots and routes is very much a part of our understanding of ourselves as Pacific peoples. And so it's going to look different to have a plan in terms of relocation, depending on where you are and the peoples that you're responding to in terms of needs and desired outcomes. I would also say that when we think about climate justice and fostering resilience, there are ways that we can ensure that we're sort of looking holistically at this. And actually, it really, it's quite consistent with notions of conflict transformation, which we might talk more about, but it's actually looking at these threads of justice that we have to ensure are there. Is distributive justice. How are the burdens and benefits distributed across time and space and peoples? Right now, the burdens are disproportionately in the global South, communities of color, again, Black and Indigenous communities. What does it look like in a climate just and resilient future? It's going to be one in which the burdens are going to be fewer and distributed more evenly. There's procedural justice. Who's at the table? Are women at the table? Are Black, Indigenous, people of color at the table? There's corrective justice. Who has been harmed to date? How have they been impaired from actually being able to maintain resilience over time? How do we repair them so that they're equally capable of withstanding the impacts of climate change, which are guaranteed? And then finally, the social justice piece is really important because we want to be able to tie the environment, which has been siloed in our thinking, to social and economic justice in a way that's meaningful. So if we understand economic policies that allow for appropriation of resources being a part of the problem, then we can see how it's connected to climate. If we think about our relationship to Indigenous communities, treaties that have not been respected, maybe the Dakota Access Pipeline would not actually have been a struggle that needed to be fought. So I think for us, especially with ICP, we are working to sort of find common language between the two communities of practice, climate and peace, and we have the opportunity in partnership with the communities we serve to help with the myriad institutional barriers to actually actualizing that just climate action and peace building. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. It's a lot to consider. It's really important that we all keep that perspective and context in mind, I believe, as we move forward. There's so much important work to be done. Thank you, Maxine, for being in the mix always. Love you. John Paul, I want to turn to you, and Maxine mentioned conflict transformation, and I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little more about how conflict transformation differs from conflict resolution. Perhaps you can share with us in a more nuanced way than is obvious by the two names. And are there examples that you can share from your work in community that illustrate the process and potential of conflict transformation as opposed to conflict resolution?
Yeah. Well, certainly, but let me just say first, thank you, Maxine. That was a terrific response, very resonant. So the easiest way that I have to explain this comes from the experiential moment when I faced a transformative question. And that was in Central America in the 1980s, when I was tasked with developing a set of workshops around conflict resolution in a context where there were 3 active civil wars in that region during that decade. And it was to be aimed toward mostly community leaders affected by those wars in support of what they were trying to do locally. So what I recall is the question that transformed so much for me was the first time I actually used or made a small presentation to about 30 of those community leaders. The very first question that came was from a person who was actually quite a close friend. He is from Honduras. And his question, his hand went up and he said, I just have one question because I'm not clear on this. He said, what do you mean by resolution? This was, of course, in Spanish, so I'm speaking to out of a different language, but it's actually a very common, similar word, resolución. What do you mean by resolution? And then he went on to answer his own question before I could even give pause. He said, because if what you mean is that you're coming down here to solve our problems without changing anything, we're not interested because we've already had too much of that. And there are so many layers to that response that he gave, but the one that I would mention today is that it is very possible to solve things and not change anything. That is, that you go after finding a fix to a problem that's, you might have called it the low-hanging fruit. There might be ways that you could try to figure out how for this next 2 years we're going to handle things in Tucson or Denver or somewhere, wherever you may be located, what Hawaii will do for a particular dilemma that's right now. And that impulse is not necessarily bad, but the transformational lens refuses to be taken over by the immediacy of finding a solution to something that has those deep roots to it. And those deep roots, the challenge of deep roots is that they have a capacity to replicate themselves over and again in new and different forms. So to understand a transformational approach, you have to hold the ambiguity and the challenge of both what have been the patterns. You have to find ways of seeing that which lies underground, if you will, and not just sort of cut off things that appear above surface. And you have to ask, how are we going to change both the patterns that produce this and find creative solutions to the challenges that we face? So it's a both and equation. But what I found is that a resolutionary lens, that is a lens that's looking for a solution, does not always ask the transformational inquiry, doesn't want to pursue it always. The transformational inquiry will always ask about what's the nature of the patterns and what's the nature of the change that we are attempting to understand and pursue. And typically what you find is that the nature of the change has very much to do with the quality of our relationships. That quality of relationships has been deeply out of balance and very harmfully expressed over years, decades, and even centuries. So an example, and one I think that's relevant to the context of the Institute and this seminar today, would come from the work in Nepal, the better part of a decade plus, going on probably 14 years for me, but certainly ongoing well beyond that now that I am no longer traveling 4 to 5 times a year as a part of that work. And it had to do with local communities that faced conflicts over natural resources, very proximate to the issues that we're talking about. In rural communities of Nepal, this often had to do with access to water, access to forest, particularly for protecting a forest because it was a lifeline for many people in reference to cooking and other things, but they had to find ways to keep it in your, available for generations to come. And access to land, especially when there was large scale displacement from the war or from, for example, periods of time within Nepal when they did face the question of slavery, and bonded laborers might be released, the Mukta Kamaya, and they would be released with no real support system. So where do they go? They have to go to a place where they have water, and they have to go to a place where they can cook food. So they gravitate to the edges of forests and near rivers, and that creates conflict over land, water, and forestry. Within that phenomenon, Nepal developed one of the, not the exclusive one, but one of the most extraordinary sets of movements, which they refer to as user group movements. So a user group, forest user group, would be a local group that established itself to provide protection for a local forest. A water user group would be a local group that establishes itself in order to look at the quality of water and to provide its benefits for those who depended on that upstream and downstream. And these became large-scale networks that were federated. Federated meaning that the localities found ways of linking up into a network that became national. So the forest user group, as an example, probably numbers somewhere between 7 and 8 million people, a third of the population of Nepal. But they had some basic principles when they started, and they were extraordinary principles. One principle was that no local group can start unless it's half men and half women. And no leadership will be done on the basis of a single person. It will always be a man and a woman elected to co-lead a local group, or to represent up one level to the district, or to represent up one level to the region, or to the national committee that they eventually established. That was a principle that fractally ran the whole system of their understanding. The second was that you didn't join as a professional, you joined as a local participant. You had to be a member of somewhere where you were local and you were connected. The challenge that they faced is that during a period of a civil war, a lot of the things that they needed to deal with became exacerbated. Weapons were introduced into the conflicts. There were a whole range of things that began to happen where these conflicts over forests or land became very vicious, very exclusionary. And so our work was to work with a group that now calls itself the Natural Resource Conflict Transformation Movement. And they always consider themselves a movement, although they have locations in different places where they actually have some offices. And what they developed over a number of years was a very much of a transformational model. It was asking the question, why do these conflicts last for 20 and 25 years? The police, the courts, the rich people, nobody could sort this thing out. And their primary conclusion was that it ultimately had to do with the breakdown, absolute breakdown of relationships. And that if they were to reconstruct something, they were going to have to rebuild an understanding of what we meant for that locality, which included the Dalit, the women, the Mutakamaya, all the way up into the castes that would have been of greater privilege. And their model was one which was based on creating a form of conversation that did not rely on outside expertise facilitation, kind of at odds with some of what our field often proposes. They worked with an embedded model. That is, that they felt that within each of the conflicting groups, you could find people who would be capable of traveling together to visit each of the communities that felt the harm. And as they did that, they actually circulated. They came to call, they referenced the whole thing of the spider work that you find in the moral imagination. This became a very powerful metaphor because the spider webs in Nepal are enormous. They can run for miles. They're extraordinary. And if you actually study them, you can see how you click a little part of the web over here, way over another part of a bush or something. The whole bush will move because it's connected. And so they began to use they actually used the metaphoric travel of the spider for their model. That is, that a group of 2 or 3 from each of the conflicting groups would go and travel together to visit each of the communities where the person or pair from that community were the people who set up the conversation and led it. And the others who were coming from outside listened. In other words, it's a form of collective empathy. You're listening not to be in the shoes of another person, you're listening to be in the house of the whole community. You're doing whole community listening. What does it feel like to listen what this experience has been for that community? And then you go to the next and you go around and around until you get to a place where people begin to share ideas about what they think could work if they were willing to enter a process. That group has now, I think it's well over 200, maybe 300 cases that some of them dated more than 25 years that they have transformed. It's a language they use. They say transformation is shifting the quality of relationship. If you don't shift the relationship, the conflict will repeat. And so that's the basic model that they've used on essentially what are local natural resource conflicts in Nepal.
That's a really powerful and elegant example. Thank you. And I can see so vividly those spider webs, and I guess I'd like to use your example to kind of move into our final question, given the limitations of time. But the question I would like to direct to either or both of you, a lot of the process you just described is, of course, aligned with and certainly supportive of indigenous peace processes and restorative processes, and like Ho'oponopono in many ways, and so far as the community listening that you spoke about. And there is, in the 200-year present, of course, an emphasis on acknowledging the past in order to move forward, acknowledge the lived experiences of people who have for generations suffered loss, and those who are struggling still with violence or discrimination. So a lot of this is important to the work of Kanakamoli here, and I wanted to ask is this question, your thoughts on the value of storytelling and indigenous wisdom and information and expertise. How important is that in terms of the work of peace building and in climate justice? And do you feel like there are connections? I'm sorry, it's a layered question, but it's my last one. Are there layered connections between Eastern and indigenous conflict transformation processes?
Maya, that is a really layered question, and I do want to respond adequately, and so I think I might just take pieces of it and actually first say that what John Paul was sharing in terms of real world examples of how to engage are processes of seeing each other and holding space for one another that is very distinct from the way we do business in the United States. And it would be, as an example, it would be, I think it'd be sort of not fully disclosing some of the levels of discomfort that this might provide people, right? You're sitting and thinking about it and you're like, well, that sounds like it's very time consuming, right? That sounds like it might be really difficult. It might lay bare things that I may not want to confront. And I suppose what I would offer is something that I had been told back in law school, you know, pay now or pay later, sort of the way it really was reduced down to. And the idea is that the time that we spend in building these spaces and creating spaces of trust and kinship and seeing one another are valuable, and avoid times like now where we are sort of ground to a halt in ways that don't have the same amount of agency and coordination and cooperation that we might want to see. I want to just very quickly also offer up the pieces of intersectionality and holism that I think is very inherent in these kinds of rooted approaches, which is to say that we think about, for example, in environmental justice, environment, again, not as some other out there, it's where we live, work, and play. And it is very much about those spaces being one and the same. We also want to think about the elements of, say, the great work that's happening right now in thinking about feminist recovery with respect to COVID. That also has a very beautiful resonance in the climate context as well, where we know that the well-being of women and girls, which has in some contexts and cultures been sidelined, the well-being of women and girls is critical for a low carbon, zero carbon future. And so I'll just offer up a few of those couple of perspectives on the difference that this introduces, but the possibilities for intersection, for holding space, and for subdued voices to actually be amplified.
Yeah, it is a terrific question and very layered. So what I might add to this from what Maxine said is just simply I'm currently one of the things that's on my desk is to serve as a support and advisor to the Colombian Truth Commission, which goes by the extraordinarily unusual and poetic name, when placed in the right English, of the Commission to Shed Light on the Truth, Learn to Live Together, and Never Repeat Violence. It's a very long title for a commission, but it is, those three things are actually rather extraordinary because they are asking the commission to engage in a way that holds the past, present, and future holistically together. Because the truth of the matter is, similar to James Baldwin's famous phrase, I think it was, the past is not even past, it's not even over, it's here. It's like John Mbiti, the famous African philosopher, first coined this phrase, that the past lies before us, which was the linguistic structure that his language group was using. That is, that we have the notion that the future is before us because we think that we can act in a way that we control it. Whereas other linguistic groups would say that you walk somewhat backwards into the future. It's a mystery, it's not fully known. So what you're facing is actually what you have lived and known. So the past that lies before us is a rather evocative phrase that captures some of this. What I've found from, in particular, the Colombian context, are three levels of how and why the past is so significant for transformation, that has an enduring quality of improving our ability to be, to rehumanize, to come back together as a human community. The first is that there's a part of truth that's purely content, almost statistic-like, which is that we know that there were 5 million displaced people. We know that there were that many massacres. We know that that many people died. So there's a level at which we know things. The difference that the Truth Commission has to bring to that is to shift from knowing to acknowledgement, to recognizing. That is to place a public legitimacy to the experience of those who suffered. And that's what has been such a big gap, is it's not always easy to move from knowing to acknowledging. Often in the movement, people are worried about guilt and whether it's going to mean that I'm responsible. And so we try to outsource so much of this. I want to outsource racism in America to an earlier generation that didn't do it right. I don't want to take responsibility that I not only benefited from it, but I still live with it in ways that make my life so much easier than others as a white male. And this acknowledgement is not easy. But the third one, which I found fascinating and sometimes daunting, is that it's not just acknowledging, but it is that people who have suffered, to place it in this frame of reference, that they want to feel acknowledged. And so often what people do that they assume is acknowledging actually doesn't feel like it. It feels like a way to, it feels like escapism, like trying to go yet around and to repeat the same old thing over and again, rather than doing it in a way. So how we enter there, I think, into the challenge that in part this is about how the bridge in some ways between deep trauma and healing remains in some ways the arts. That is, that we have to find the artistry of what it is that resonates in such a way that people sense and feel it. And that has rarely been possible when it lands purely on paper in the form of policy or a single court rendition or whatever the case may be. It has something to do with the fact that we begin to come around. This is where I think, yes, to your question about wisdom traditions, indigenous traditions, East and West, these seem to be the resonating factors, that they are about ways in which not just knowledge, but wisdom was brought to bear that opened some pathway to us being able to reconnect in our humanity. And this is where in my field of peace building, we've so often focused on the technical aspects of negotiation and arriving at solutions and whatnot, that we lose sight that really much of this is about kind of what I call the art and soul. If it's to touch at the level that it has to touch for the change to be enduring. And where you find that, in my estimation, is more often than not in proximity to people who have found ways to survive the impossible, who have found ways to recuperate voice in the unspeakable. That is, that they are artists of survival. If you wanted to know about what we need to do to survive in the climate pandemic, you might want to visit the Honduran mother with her child that traveled by foot from Tegucigalpa and is now in a retention facility in Eloy, Arizona. Because that woman will teach you things from her life about the artistry of survival, about what it meant to know who, to know how, to know when. And even though in the deepest of circumstances, she will continuously tell you, I'm connected. Alone, I'm dead. And so one of the clearest things that we find from these folks is that our survival depends upon our capacity to understand interdependence, our capacity to understand that we are part of a human community. I'll maybe leave it there. I'm kind of rambling here, so I'll stop there.
No, it's such gorgeous rambling. I mean, you've both given us so much to think about. You're both extraordinary. You've expanded our minds. I wish I could expand time and generate more of it in this moment. I wish I could generate a 200-year present that would allow for all of your words and everyone's questions. I'm going to hand it over quickly now to Zelda with thanks for all that you have said. And Zelda is going to ask a couple of questions from the community, time permitting.
Thank you so much, Maya, John Paul, and Maxine. And I just want to echo John Paul, echo Maya, John Paul. You are not rambling. If you have a moment to look into the chat, I'm also receiving text messages from people in this room. Maxine and John Paul, what you're talking about is really resonating. So thank you so much. We are tight on time, but I want to honor asking at least a couple of questions that have come in from the community, and also let community members know that we'll collect these questions, and ICP will do our best, the questions we can't answer right here and right now, to address these questions in other webinars or over email, so they won't go completely unanswered. So the first question I'm going to direct to you, Maxine, kind of quickly. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in around how-tos. What are some things I can do in my daily life to build the social cohesion that you're talking about, to help build peace? And particularly, how do we do that when we are up against perhaps, as one person said, governmental mistrust, as another person said, up against, people saying, look, this is too urgent, and taking the time to build social cohesion it's going to take too much time. So can you give a couple of examples of things we can do in our daily life, especially when we're up against challenges, to build this social cohesion?
Okay, great question that I cannot do justice in with the time that we have, but I will say this. One, I had the same questions as someone who's coming to this purely from sort of the climate change perspective, and certainly the law and policy, like how do we hack this problem when it became so critically important to think about interdependence in the ways that John Paul described. And the examples he gives are perfect. And so what I ended up doing is calling on my dear friend Maya to say, how do we figure this out, right? And then actually seeing the synergies between the justice work and the peace building work and the conflict transformation work, which is about setting up conversations. The other piece that I want to suggest as a model is the fact that when we saw the incredible events of June, and when we understood that we are here now in terms of understanding the deep systemic racism and anti-Black racism, racial hierarchy that gets us to this moment, was because there was an absence of conversation and an absence of rigorous conversation, especially in the communities in which it needed to happen. And so what I thought was always so profoundly fascinating were those who work on having conversations about race, say, with other white folks, right? And some of the goals were as simple as try to find 3 people to talk to without any people of color around and talk about race. And that is actually a win. And so we have these opportunities, I think, in the context of climate, in the context of the injustices that are tied up in it, to start having these conversations every day, all day, as we would say in the community, right? All day, every day, to have these conversations about what we're looking for. That provides not only the opportunity to find synergies and compatibilities, but also to understand where some of the tensions are, and to also build a movement. A lot of what we need to be doing has to trickle up into the decision making, and we're stronger together. And I think, frankly, we're seeing a lot of that in the political activism and engagement that's happening in the context now of systemic racism, but has also been happening over a longer time scale with respect to climate. Again, so much more can be said about it, but we'll provide the resources as necessary.
Thank you so much, Maxine. And I know we're just getting over time, so I'll ask one more question that we can close on. And for folks who need to hop off to other calls, please go ahead. This is being recorded, and we'll make sure you all get a copy. John Paul, you speak of the importance of creativity and the work of peace building, and you call on us to be open and to even seek serendipity. So when we're working on existential crises like inequality, the call for serendipity might sound kind of frivolous or certainly difficult. Can you talk about what you mean when you say serendipity is an integral part of the work, and give us a couple of examples?
Sure. And do it in a haiku form with 2 minutes left, right?
Please, please.
So I recognize that this will have some limits to it, so I apologize ahead of time. So I found it extremely useful to go back to the origin of the word serendipity, which was first coined by Horace Walpole in the 1700s. And he had received a gift, and he was writing a letter when he wrote a sentence that still appears in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is essentially that serendipity is the discovery by accident and sagacity of things you were not in search of. And there's so much richness in that across the 3 levels. Discovery, that is, that you keep an open mind, which basically says that you have to approach this work we're doing with an enormous amount of humility, because none of us actually knows it fully, what's coming or how we're going to figure it out. Humility, I think, keeps you open to evolving understanding of truth, but it also keeps your eyes and ears open to wisdom that emerges from the least likely of sources. Because we tend to too often listen only to those that we think have a certain level of formal expertise. And actually many of the answers that we may need may lie far outside of that. So serendipity as discovery is that you create an ongoing commitment to openness and not a dogmatic narrowness to a particular thing. The second is that phrase accident and sagacity. Most people hear the word serendipity and only think of accidental. It happened accidentally. It was unexpected, which is true. The word sagacity means wisdom. So when you combine the unexpected with wisdom, you suddenly are in a place where it returns that notion of openness, but it also is attending to the legitimacy that experiential wisdom offers things that often those of us who are distant or not proximate to the particular concerns that are being dealt on, which is why in peace building, I think the whole of the movement has to shift much more to locally led, how to lead from the experience of people who are proximate to that. But often their knowledge is less valued than those who are, for one form or another, seen as carrying that expertise. So there's a difference, again, that I was saying earlier between knowledge and wisdom. And I think serendipity actually is about attentiveness to wisdom, not just to what is known. The final one is that you were not in search of. This is a mystery. I don't know how you all feel about it, but for me, the longer I work with peace building, the more mysterious it becomes. Because in your early years, maybe your viewpoint is, if I just do this right technique, I'll control things. And one of the greatest challenges that you'll ever face in life is the challenge of risk, of letting go of control. And that is that you don't fully know, and you don't know to control what's about to come completely. And that places you in a location that I don't have any other words to call except it's a form of spirituality. It's about being just, you know, we're born naked and we're going to leave the world naked. Just face it, people, that's what's going to happen. So we don't start from a place, any of us, no matter who we are, that's anything other than that. And to retain that capacity that says, ultimately, we're going to have to find ways to do the best that we can with what we know, but we're going to have to also be open to those things that we don't yet know. And we have to recognize, in many instances, for many of us, that unlearning the sacred things that we thought we knew have to be let go of. And unlearning takes courage, because you take the thing that you may hold most precious and you're actually going to say, I have to look at it again. I have to look more carefully. And so for me, serendipity in large part was that most of my work with local communities has been finding ways for people to actually in part believe that what they have learned is not only valid, but it is the light on the pathway. And my work alongside of that should not be overvalued as if it's the flashlight that's going to show something in the darkness. It is that somehow in the ability of being together and finding ways to open up what is known, we together unlearn and learn and discover things that we were not expecting that are those emergent. So a lot of this is captured somewhat in emergent learning, but I don't think that often becomes sort of a technical process that reverts back to the old model. I'm after serendipity as the humility to stay open to what's on the periphery, and not exclusively what it is that you've been blinded by in reference to your purpose. And I think we get ourselves in trouble when we shut down the periphery. And you can take that layered, because it's got a lot of layers that can go with it.
Thank you so much for that, John Paul, and thank you both and Maya for facilitating this incredible conversation. But before we began this webinar today, I was sharing with John Paul that the Institute for Climate and Peace keeps a folder on our share drive, and we started it back in the beginning, and the folder's labeled our indispensables, and it's where we keep resources and writings that are a touchstone for our work that we revisit frequently, that helped us to build this organization. And today's webinar was so exciting for me because in that indispensables folder are writings by both John Paul and Maxine. And so it was so exciting for me to have this kind of come together live today. And I feel incredibly uplifted and inspired. And I'm going to put the recording of this webinar into our indispensables folder as soon as we wrap this afternoon. So I just want to thank you both so much for your time, especially for going overtime, and to everybody who was able to join us today for this conversation, for carving out the hour and being a part of one of our webinars. And I'm going to just turn it over quickly to Maxine to close us out with that uplifting haiku she promised us at the start of this session. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Maxine?
Thanks, Zelda. Inspired by the sort of coming together of these communities of practice, climate and peace, my final haiku is, after tomorrow, all lives flourish in the sun, clear eyes and full hearts. Thank you.
Mahalo nui, everyone. Thank you so much for this time and the stories that you bring. Aloha.